The year was 1348, and across the cobblestone streets of medieval Europe, church bells rang with a frequency that had nothing to do with prayer. These bronze voices carried a message more chilling than any sermon. Another woman had been discovered in adultery, and the machinery of justice was grinding to life. In an age where a wife's fidelity was considered as essential as the harvest itself, betrayal of the marriage bed was not merely a personal failing, but a crime against God, king, and community that demanded the most brutal retribution imaginable. What we are about to explore ventures into the darkest corners of medieval justice, where the punishment for a woman's infidelity often exceeded in horror the crimes of murderers and thieves. The popular imagination, shaped by romantic tales and sanitized histories, has largely forgotten these systematic campaigns of terror designed to control female sexuality through the application of unimaginable cruelty. But the records remain, preserved in dusty archives and legal manuscripts, documenting a world where a woman's suspected unfaithfulness could transform her from protected wife to public spectacle in a matter of hours. Medieval Europe operated under a complex web of laws, customs, and religious doctrines that viewed female adultery as one of the most dangerous threats to social order. Unlike male infidelity, which was often overlooked or treated as a minor transgression, a wife's betrayal struck at the very foundation of medieval society: the certainty of legitimate inheritance, the honor of the family name, and the divine order that placed women under the absolute authority of their husbands. The punishments devised for this crime reflected not merely legal justice, but a calculated campaign to terrorize women into submission through the public destruction of those who dared transgress. The medieval mind understood spectacle as education. Every public punishment served as both retribution and instruction, teaching the assembled crowds what fate awaited those who challenged established order. For adulterous wives, this meant their suffering was carefully choreographed to maximize both physical agony and psychological terror. The authorities who designed these punishments were not sadists acting on impulse, but educated men, judges, clergy, and nobles, who believed they were preserving civilization itself through the systematic application of cruelty. The legal framework surrounding adultery varied across medieval Europe, but certain principles remained constant. A married woman belonged to her husband in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. She was his property in the most literal sense, and her body was considered his exclusive domain. Any violation of this ownership was treated as theft of the most heinous variety, combined with an assault on male honor that demanded public vindication. The husband's reputation, his family's standing, and even his economic prospects could be destroyed by his wife's infidelity, making her punishment a matter of community survival rather than personal revenge. Canon law, the religious legal system that governed much of medieval life, treated adultery as a form of spiritual pollution that contaminated not just the individuals involved, but their entire community. Church authorities argued that unfaithful wives were instruments of Satan, spreading corruption through society like a plague. This theological framework justified punishments that would have been considered excessive for common criminals, as the stakes were seen as nothing less than the eternal souls of everyone involved. The most widespread punishment for adultery was public humiliation designed to strip away every vestige of feminine dignity and social standing. In towns across France, Germany, and England, convicted adulteresses were forced to parade through the streets, wearing only their undergarments or specially designed garments marked with symbols of their shame. These processions were carefully timed to coincide with market days when the maximum number of witnesses would be present to observe the spectacle. The crowds that gathered for these exhibitions were not passive observers but active participants in the punishment. Townspeople were encouraged to mock, jeer, and throw refuse at the condemned women as they passed. Children were lifted onto shoulders to get better views, learning from an early age what fate awaited women who violated social norms. The psychological impact of this public degradation often proved more devastating than physical torture, destroying the victim's ability to function in society even after the formal punishment ended. Many communities developed elaborate rituals around these public shamings. The adulteress might be forced to carry symbols of her crime, a distaff to represent her failure as a proper wife, or a bundle of straw to suggest her worthlessness. In some regions, she was made to wear a crown of straw or a special hood that marked her as an outcast. These visual markers served to extend the punishment beyond the formal ceremony, as anyone who saw her in subsequent months would immediately recognize her crime and treat her accordingly. The involvement of clergy in these punishments added a layer of religious terror to the proceedings. Priests would often accompany the procession, delivering sermons about the spiritual corruption of adultery while the condemned woman was paraded before the crowd. The message was clear. This was not merely secular justice, but divine retribution, sanctioned by God himself. The combination of religious authority and legal power created an atmosphere of absolute condemnation that few could psychologically survive intact. Beyond public humiliation, many jurisdictions employed physical punishments specifically designed for adulterous wives. The ducking stool, a chair attached to a long arm that could plunge the victim repeatedly into a river or pond, was commonly used for various female offences but was particularly associated with adultery. The near-drowning experience was intended to purify the woman of her sins while providing entertainment for spectators who gathered along the riverbank to watch her ordeal. The process of Duke regulated to maximising was carefully suffering without causing immediate death. The victim would be strapped into the chair and slowly lowered into the water until completely submerged, then raised gasping and choking to the surface before being plunged again. This cycle might continue for an hour or more, with the crowd counting each submersion and calling for more when they felt justice had not been adequately served. The psychological terror of knowing that each plunge might be the last, combined with the physical agony of repeated near-drowning, created an experience of such intensity that many women emerged permanently broken in mind and spirit. In regions where water was scarce or where local customs demanded more elaborate punishments, other devices were employed. The branx, or scold's bridle, was a metal framework that enclosed the head and included a spiked plate that pressed against the tongue, making speech impossible and eating agonizing. Adulterous wives might be forced to wear these devices for days or weeks, paraded through town while unable to defend themselves or even cry out in pain. The symbolism was deliberate. The mouth that had spoken words of love to a forbidden partner was now sealed and tortured, teaching other women the price of verbal intimacy with men other than their husbands. The stocks presented another avenue for public punishment that combined physical discomfort with social humiliation. The adulteress would be secured by her neck, wrists, or ankles in a wooden frame set up in the town square, leaving her helpless while passers-by were invited to express their disapproval through verbal abuse or the hurling of rotten vegetables, mud, and worse substances. The duration of this punishment varied, but sentences of several days were common, forcing the victim to endure exposure to weather, denial of basic needs, and constant harassment from the community. What made these punishments particularly cruel was their open-ended nature. While a thief might be whipped and released, an adulterous wife faced ongoing social death that could last for years. Even after completing her formal sentence, she remained marked by her crime, excluded from normal social interactions and economic opportunities. Many found themselves unable to return to their families, rejected by churches, and reduced to begging or prostitution for survival, a final irony that saw them punished for sexual transgression by being forced into sexual commerce. The documentation of these punishments reveals a society obsessed with controlling female sexuality through the systematic application of terror. Court records, church archives, and chroniclers' accounts all attest to the frequency and severity of these brutal spectacles, suggesting that medieval authorities understood them as essential tools for maintaining social order. The records from medieval German states reveal particularly horrific innovations in the punishment of adulterous wives, punishments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance while maintaining the pretense of legal justice. The Germanic legal tradition, influenced by both Roman law and tribal customs, developed a systematic approach to female sexual transgression that would influence punishment methods across Northern Europe for centuries. In the Holy Roman Empire, the punishment known as running the gauntlet was adapted specifically for adulteresses, forcing them to walk naked between two rows of townspeople armed with switches, rods, and whips. Unlike military versions of this punishment, which aimed for swift justice, the civilian adaptation was designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. The condemned woman would be driven slowly through the human corridor, her pace controlled by guards who ensured every member of the crowd had ample opportunity to strike her. The psychological torment of seeing the faces of neighbors, friends, and even family members among those inflicting pain created wounds that extended far beyond the physical lacerations covering her body. Contemporary accounts describe how these events became community festivals, with vendors selling refreshments and families bringing children to witness what they considered moral education. The transformation of human suffering into public entertainment reveals the medieval mindset that saw cruelty as both necessary and righteous when applied to those who violated social norms. The adulteress became less than human in the eyes of her tormentors, reduced to a symbol that could be destroyed without moral consequence. The Italian city-states developed their own distinctive approaches to punishing unfaithful wives, often incorporating elements of their mercantile culture into the spectacle of justice. In Venice, adulteresses might be loaded onto specially constructed boats and rowed through the canals while being pelted with refuse from bridges and waterside buildings. The confined space of the boat prevented escape, while the water below offered the constant threat of drowning should the victim lose her footing under the barrage of projectiles. Florence pioneered the use of artistic humiliation, commissioning painters to create life-sized portraits of condemned adulteresses that would be displayed in public squares with detailed descriptions of their crimes. These painted shames, as they were known, served as permanent monuments to female transgression, remaining on display long after the physical punishment ended. The artistic skill invested in these works paradoxically elevated the humiliation, creating beautiful depictions of moral ugliness that drew crowds of admirers who came to study both the craftsmanship and the cautionary tale. The Spanish Inquisition, though primarily concerned with religious heresy, also involved itself in cases of adultery when they could be connected to broader questions of moral corruption. Spanish authorities developed interrogation techniques that combined physical torture with psychological manipulation, seeking not merely confession but detailed accounts of every intimate moment shared with the forbidden partner. These extracted testimonies were then read aloud during public ceremonies, transforming private passion into public pornography that simultaneously titillated and horrified the assembled crowds. The garrote, a metal collar tightened by a screw mechanism, was employed not to kill but to bring the victim to the edge of consciousness repeatedly. Each tightening would be accompanied by demands for more intimate details about her adultery, creating a Pavlovian association between sexual memory and more. Many tal terror, women emerged from these sessions unable to engage in physical intimacy even within marriage, their capacity for pleasure permanently destroyed by the association with pain. French courts developed perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated punishments, recognizing that social death could be more devastating than physical torture. The ritual of civic death involved a formal ceremony where the adulteress was declared legally deceased, her name struck from all records, her property redistributed, and her family forbidden from acknowledging her existence. She would then be forced to live in the same community as a non-person, visible to all but legally invisible, unable to own property, enter contracts, or even receive charity from religious institutions. This living death created a unique form of torture where the victim remained physically present but socially annihilated. Former friends would look through her as if she were invisible, shopkeepers would refuse her custom, and even beggars would reject her company. The psychological isolation proved so devastating that many women subjected to civic death took their own lives within months, preferring actual death to this twilight existence between the living and the dead. The English common law tradition developed its own approaches to adultery punishment, often focusing on economic destruction rather than purely physical torture. The concept of husband right allowed the wronged spouse to claim not only his wife's property, but also any assets she might have brought to the marriage, effectively reducing her to absolute destitution. Combined with social ostracism, this economic warfare created a web of punishment that ensured the adulteress would suffer for years rather than hours. English courts also pioneered the use of public confessions that required the condemned woman to describe her sins in explicit detail before assembled congregations. These forced testimonies served multiple purposes. They satisfied prurient curiosity, reinforced social norms, and created lasting psychological trauma for the speaker. The act of verbalizing intimate moments in a sacred space, surrounded by the moral authority of the church, created an association between sexuality and sacrilege that could permanently damage the victim's spiritual life. The punishment of branding, borrowed from the marking of livestock, was applied to adulteresses with particular symbolic meaning. The letter A burned into the forehead, cheek, or breast created a permanent mark of shame that would identify the woman's crime for the rest of her life. Unlike other punishments that ended after a prescribed period, branding ensured lifelong consequences that affected not only the victim but potentially her children, who might face social rejection due to their mother's marked shame. The branding process itself was designed to maximize suffering, using irons heated to specific temperatures that would create the deepest possible scar without causing immediate death. The victim would be held down by multiple attendants while the red-hot metal was pressed into her flesh, the smell of burning skin serving as a visceral reminder to spectators of the consequences of sexual transgression. The healing process, often complicated by infection due to medieval medical limitations, extended the punishment for weeks as the wound festered and scarred. Regional variations in punishment reflected local customs and available resources, but the underlying principle remained constant: the systematic destruction of women who violated sexual norms through carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror. Northern European communities, influenced by harsh climates and warrior traditions, favored punishments that tested physical endurance. Southern regions, with their emphasis on honor and reputation, developed more sophisticated forms of social and psychological torture. These medieval punishments for adultery reveal a systematic campaign of terror designed to control female sexuality through the application of unimaginable cruelty. The elaborate tortures, public humiliations, and social annihilations we have explored were not aberrations but carefully constructed tools of social control that reduced women to property and their bodies to battlegrounds for male honor. The echoes of these dark practices remind us how fragile human dignity becomes when societies prioritize control over compassion, leaving us to ponder what remnants of such thinking might still lurk in our modern world.